Chapter 1. The Woman at the Creek. The air at Dead Man's Creek didn't just carry the scent of pine and damp earth, it carried the weight of secrets. Dead Man's Creek did not earn its name quietly, it whispered it. Over and over, through the stones. The water slid over shale and bone-white pebbles with a sound like breath leaving a body, slow, persistent, impossible to silence. Even in summer, when the creek ran low and clear, it carried a chill that had nothing to do with weather. Folks in the valley said it was memory. They said the land remembered blood the way it remembered rain, and that some stains never truly washed away. Annie Carter had lived beside that creek for nearly 3 years, and she had never once asked how it got its name. She knew better than to invite ghosts into a house already full of shadows. The homestead sat crooked against the bend of the water, its boards weathered to a ghostly gray, its roof sagging like an old man's shoulders under the weight of a long life. One shutter hung by a single rusted hinge, knocking softly, tap, 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 whenever the wind drifted down from the jagged hills. The fence leaned more than it stood, a skeleton of cedar rails bleached white by the sun. In the barn, the mule, old Jasper, had taken to braying at the moon lately, a sound so lonesome it made Annie's ribs ache. Annie rose before dawn, pulling herself from sleep while the world was still a bruised, hazy blue. Her body moved by habit, a machine of bone and necessity. She dressed in the dark to save the lamp oil, slipping into a cotton dress so thin she could feel the morning chill through the fabric. As she tied her hair back with a scrap of cloth, she caught her reflection in the cracked mirror above the wash basin. She stopped. She looked older than 24. The girl who had arrived here 3 years ago, clutching a bundle of clothes and a heart full of terror, was gone. In her place was a woman with cheekbones sharp as flint and eyes that had seen too much of the horizon. Yet, there was a stubborn beauty left in her, the kind found in wild wheat that refuses to break in a storm. She lit the stove, coaxing a flame from the stubborn hickory wood. The cabin began to fill with the scent of wood smoke and the lingering aroma of last night's beans. "Mama?" The voice was a tiny anchor, pulling Annie back to the present. Lila sat up in the narrow corner bed, her dark curls a wild halo, her eyes wide and sleepy. At 3 years old, she was the only soft thing in Annie's world. "I'm here, baby," Annie whispered, crossing the room to smooth a curl from the girl's forehead. Lila clutched her rag doll, its button eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. The creek was loud tonight. Was it mad? Annie's hands stilled for a heartbeat. She looked toward the window, where the mist clung to the glass like a shroud. No sugar. Just talking to itself. Like an old man telling stories. "I don't like the stories," Lila murmured, leaning her head against Annie's shoulder. "Then we won't listen," Annie said firmly. "Come on now. Eat your porridge. We've got a long day." They ate in a silence that wasn't heavy, but purposeful. Annie watched her daughter and felt the familiar, gnawing pressure in her chest. The flour barrel was a hollow drum. The south field was a graveyard of scorched grass. If she didn't get the fence mended, Jasper would wander off, and without that mule, they were as good as buried. "Stay inside today, Lila," Annie commanded as she finished her coffee, bitter and thin. "The dew is heavy. Play with your doll. Can I help with the garden?" "Later. When the sun's high." Annie stepped out onto the porch, the cool air hitting her face like a splash of well water. She gripped the handle of her axe, intending to head to the woodpile, but her boot stopped dead on the dirt path. There was a man at her fence. He wasn't a ghost, though he stood as still as one. He was tall, his silhouette cutting a jagged line against the rising sun. He had his back to her, leaning over the broken section of the north fence. He wore a faded denim shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle, the kind of muscle that came from years of hard, unforgiving labor. Annie's heart didn't just beat. It slammed against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Hey," she barked, her voice cracking the morning silence. "What do you think you're doing on this land?" The man didn't jump. He didn't reach for a weapon. He simply froze, his shoulders dropping an inch before he slowly, deliberately, turned to face her. He was younger than his stature suggested. Maybe 30. His face was a map of hard miles, a strong, stubborn jawline, a straight nose, and eyes the color of a summer sky just before a thunderstorm. A yellowing bruise mottled his cheekbone, and a thin, jagged scar cut across his upper lip. He lifted his hands, palms open and empty. "Mornin'. I didn't ask the time of day," Annie snapped, her fingers white-knuckled around the axe handle. "I asked what you're doing at my fence." "It was down," he said. His voice was a low rumble, like distant thunder. "Seen your mule looking at the gap. Thought I'd save you the trouble of chasing him halfway to the county line. I don't need your help, and I don't want you on my property." The man, Thad, didn't move. He looked at the axe in her hand, then back to her eyes. He didn't look at her with the hungry, predatory gaze she'd learned to fear in men. He looked at her with a weary kind of recognition, "Name's Thad," he said. "Thad Hale. I'm looking for work, ma'am, not trouble." "There's no work here," Annie said, though her eyes involuntarily flickered to the sagging barn roof and the waist-high weeds. "And there's certainly no money." "I didn't ask for money," Annie scoffed, a sharp, bitter sound. "Men always ask for something. If it isn't coin, it's worse." Thad flinched, a subtle tightening around his eyes that told her she'd hit a nerve. "I'm looking for a meal and a dry place to lay my head for a few days. I can fix that roof. I can clear that south field. I can give that mule a reason to stop crying at the moon." "How do you know about my mule?" she asked, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I've been camped a mile down creek since yesterday," he said simply. Hard not to hear him. "Sounds like he's grieving someone." Annie felt a chill that had nothing to do with the creek. "He's just old. And I'm just fine on my own." "You're holding that axe like you're ready to swing it," Thad observed, his gaze steady. "But you're shaken, ma'am. That tells me you're tired." "A tired person makes mistakes. A mistake out here. Well, that's how this creek gets more names added to its list." "Is that a threat?" "It's a fact. I've lived 'em." Annie stepped forward, the tall grass whispering against her skirts. She studied him, searching for the lie. She looked for the twitch in the jaw, the shiftiness in the eyes, the tells of a man running from the law or hunting for a victim. But all she saw was a man who looked like he'd walked 1,000 miles just to find a place to stand still. "Mama? Is the cowboy staying?" Lila was standing on the porch, her small hand gripping the doorframe. Thad's expression shifted instantly. The hardness in his eyes softened, replaced by a sudden, sharp ache. He looked at the little girl, then back at Annie, and for the first time he looked truly ashamed of his intrusion. "You got a little one," he murmured. "Go back inside, Lila," Annie ordered, her voice trembling. "I ain't a cowboy, little lady," Thad called out, ignoring Annie for a split second. "Just a man with a hammer, and a lot of work to do." He turned his attention back to Annie, his voice dropping an octave. "I give you my word. I won't step foot in that house. I'll sleep in the dirt if I have to, but you need that fence fixed before the wolves realize it's down. And they will realize it tonight." Annie looked at the fence. He'd already done more in 10 minutes than she had in 10 days. He'd used a piece of discarded wire to reinforce the base, tensioning it with a skill that spoke of a life on the trail. She thought of the empty flour barrel. She thought of the winter winds that would soon be howling through the gaps in the cabin walls. She thought of the men who might come looking for her, men who wouldn't ask permission to stand at the fence. Maybe a man like Thad was a risk, but being alone was a certainty of failure. "1 week, Annie said, her voice hard as iron. "You sleep in the barn. You don't speak to my daughter unless I'm standing right there. And if you so much as look at that door after sundown, I'll use this axe. Do you understand me, Thad Hale?" Thad nodded, a slow, solemn movement. "I understand. A week's work for a week's bread. I'll start on the barn doors once the fence is set." "Don't make me regret this," she whispered, more to herself than him. "I've got enough regrets of my own," Thad replied, turning back to the wood. "I don't have room for yours." Annie watched him for a long moment. He didn't look back. He simply picked up a fallen rail and began to heave it into place, his muscles straining against the fabric of his shirt. He worked with a quiet, rhythmic intensity, as if the labor itself was a prayer. She turned and walked back toward the cabin, the sound of his hammering echoing against the stones of the creek. Behind her, the water continued its endless, murmuring chant. It seemed to be laughing, a low, bubbling sound that chilled her to the bone. The creek knew that once you let a man into your life, you could never truly wash the scent of him away. She closed the door and bolted it. But for the first time in 3 years, the silence inside the house felt less like a sanctuary and more like a waiting room. Chapter 2. A Man Who Stays Outside. By nightfall, the fence stood straight. It wasn't a work of art. Nothing on Annie Carter's land was meant for beauty, only for survival, but it was solid. The cedar rails no longer sagged like tired, defeated shoulders under the weight of the sky. The rusted wire held tight, humming with a low, metallic tension when the wind rose off the creek and rattled through the cottonwoods. For the first time in years, the boundary between Annie's world and the wild beyond felt less like a suggestion and more like a fortress. Annie noticed these things without meaning to. She noticed the way Thad worked without a single word of complaint, his body moving with a mechanical grace that made the heavy lifting look like a dance. She noticed the way he measured twice before cutting once, his brow furrowed in a concentration so deep it seemed he was trying to mend more than just wood. She noticed the way he didn't curse when a jagged splinter bit deep into his palm. He simply sucked in a sharp breath, wiped the blood on his thigh, and kept going. She noticed because she had spent her life learning to read the weather of men. Their moods were the seasons she lived by. Their tempers were the storms she had to weather. She had learned the subtle signs of a coming gale, the tightening of a jaw, the darkening of a gaze, the heavy, expectant silence before a hand was raised. She had learned them first from her father, a man whose love was as sharp as a switch, and then from her husband, whose ghost still seemed to pace the porch on rainy nights. Thad showed none of those signs. He worked through the long, baking afternoon, the sun crawling steadily westward across the sky, the color of a faded bruise. His shirt darkened with sweat until it clung to the broad span of his back, revealing the powerful play of muscle beneath the cotton. His movements were steady, unshowy, and patient. He didn't ask for water until she offered it, and even then, he took the tin ladle with a nod so slight it was almost a bow. He didn't rest until she told him the light was failing, and when he finally did pause, he sat on the hard-packed dirt with his back against the barn, his hat tipped low over his eyes, his gaze fixed on the horizon as if it owed him an apology he knew would never come. Inside the cabin, Annie kept herself busy, though her eyes drifted to the window more often than she cared to admit. The rhythmic thud-thud-thud of his hammer was a heartbeat for the homestead. She mended a jagged tear in Lila's dress, her fingers trembling slightly as she pushed the needle through the fabric. She stirred a pot of beans she'd already stirred twice, until they were nearly a mash. She swept a floor that had been swept that morning, chasing dust motes that didn't exist. All the while, the sound of Thad's labor drifted in, metal striking wood, wood settling into place. It was a productive sound. A healing sound. It was a sound she hadn't heard in a long, lonesome time. Lila noticed it too. The child sat on the floor, her blonde curls catching the golden afternoon light that filtered through the cracks in the walls. She was kneeling with her doll, but her head was tilted toward the door, listening. "Is he fixin' the house, Mama?" Lila asked, her voice small and hopeful. Annie's needle paused mid-stitch. She didn't look up. "He's fixin' the fence, Lila. Just the fence. Will the wolves go away now?" Annie hesitated, thinking of the yellow eyes she sometimes saw in the brush, and the men in town who looked at her with the same predatory hunger. "They'll think twice before comin' in, I reckon." Lila considered this, her little face scrunched in thought. "He looks strong. Like a giant." "You don't need to be thinking about him," Annie said, her voice coming out sharper than she intended. The memory of the last strong man who had walked through her door flashed in her mind, the smell of whiskey and the weight of a heavy hand. Lila's lip trembled instantly. Her eyes, blue as the creek water, welled up. "I didn't do nothing wrong." The guilt hit Annie like a physical blow. She sighed, setting the sewing aside, and crouched in front of her daughter. She cupped Lila's warm, soft face in her hands, her thumbs brushing away a stray tear. "No, baby. You didn't. You're an angel. Mama's just tired. The heat's got me prickly." Lila wrapped her small, sticky arms around Annie's neck, squeezing tight. "You can rest when I'm big. I'll do the sweepin' and the water haulin'." Annie laughed softly, the sound catching in her throat like a burr. It was a rare, fragile sound in that cabin. "I reckon I'll hold you to that, sugar. You grow fast, you hear?" When the sun finally dipped low enough to set the creek aflame with copper and violet light, Annie stepped outside. The air had turned crisp, the humidity of the day retreating into the shadows. Thad was finishing the last section of the north line, tightening a strand of wire with a brutal, efficient twist of his wrist. "That'll hold," he said. He didn't turn around, but he knew she was there. It was as if he could feel her presence the way one feels a change in the wind. She stood a few feet back, her arms crossed over her chest. "You did good work today, Thad Hale. Better than I expected." "Thank you," he said, finally turning. He wiped his brow with the back of a scarred hand. The bruise on his cheek was darker now, a deep plum color in the twilight. "You said you'd sleep in the barn," she reminded him, her voice holding a note of warning. "I will. Jasper and I have already reached an understanding. He gets the straw, I get the corner by the tack. You need anything before dark? A lamp? More water?" He shook his head, reaching for his hat and settling it back on his head. The brim cast his eyes into shadow. "I've got a blanket. And the moon's gonna be bright enough to see by. I'll be fine." Annie hesitated. She looked at his lean frame, the way his ribs showed slightly against his shirt. She thought of the cold beans in the pot. "There's beans and biscuits. It ain't much. Mostly salt and flour, but it's filling. You're welcome to a plate." Thad looked up, and for a fleeting second, the guarded wall in his eyes crumbled. Surprise, sharp and raw, flickered across his face. "I won't say no to that, ma'am. My stomach's been singin' for an hour." They ate on opposite ends of the yard, the distance between them a physical manifestation of her distrust. Annie sat on the porch steps, Lila tucked against her side. The child swung her legs, humming a tuneless song to her doll, her eyes never leaving the man by the barn. Thad sat on an overturned crate near the stable doors, his plate balanced on his knees. The silence between them was not empty. It was watchful, heavy with the things they weren't saying. The only sounds were the scraping of spoons against tin and the distant, rhythmic rush of the water over the stones. "How long you been on the trail?" Annie asked finally, the question jumping out of her before she could stop it. Thad swallowed a bite of biscuit, his gaze traveling to the dark tree line. "Long enough to forget the taste of a chair." "That ain't an answer." "No, ma'am. It's the only one I've got that won't spoil the meal." Annie studied him over the rim of her tin cup, the way he carried himself, the alertness, the way his hand stayed near his belt even when he was eating, spoke of a man who was used to being hunted. "You runnin' from something? The law? Or a ghost?" He met her gaze evenly, his blue eyes piercing even in the fading light. "Aren't we all, Annie Carter? Some of us just run faster than others." She didn't like how easily that landed. She didn't like that he knew her name sounded like a question. After supper, Annie ushered Lila inside. She barred the door with a heavy oak beam, a sound that echoed like a gunshot in the quiet room. It was habit. It was protection. She extinguished the lamp early, the smell of burnt wick lingering in the air, and lay awake in the dark. Outside, the barn creaked as it settled into the night. Jasper shifted in his stall, snorting softly. Somewhere beyond the trees, a great horned owl called out, a lonely, haunting sound, and farther still, the creek whispered on, telling its secrets to the shale. Annie did not sleep easily. She dreamed of the past, of heavy boots on the porch, of hands gripping her wrists until they bruised, of raised voices that drowned out the wind. She dreamed of Dead Man's Creek rising, the water turning red and rushing too fast to cross, pulling her and Lila into the depths. She woke with a start, her heart racing, her nightdress dampened with cold sweat. Moonlight spilled through the cracks in the shutters, silvering the floor like spilled milk. She listened, her breath held tight in her chest. Footsteps. They were outside, near the porch. Slow. Deliberate. They weren't the light, hushing steps of someone trying to sneak. They were heavy and honest. Annie reached for the axe she kept propped beside her bed, her fingers curling around the cold wood. She slid out of bed, bare feet silent on the floorboards, and moved toward the door. The steps stopped just short of the stairs. A long pause followed. Then, Thad's voice drifted through the wood, low, careful, and anchored in reality. "Miss Carter?" Annie didn't answer. She didn't move. "I ain't coming closer," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, but carrying clearly in the night air. "I just wanted you to know. I heard something moving near the tree line. Might have been a coyote checking the new fence. Might have been something worse. I'll be staying awake a while. On the porch of the barn. You can sleep." Her grip on the axe loosened just a fraction, the tension in her shoulders dropping an inch. "You said you wouldn't come to the house." "I didn't," he replied, and she could almost hear the ghost of a sad smile in his voice. "And I won't. My word's the only thing I've got left that hasn't been shot full of holes." Silence reclaimed the yard. "Thank you," she said finally, her voice sounding foreign to her own ears. "Good night, ma'am." The footsteps retreated, moving back toward the barn. Annie stood by the door for a long time after, staring at the barred wood. The fear didn't vanish, but it shifted, changing shape. The echo of his words settled into her bones, warmer than the quilt on her bed. Morning came cold and pale, a layer of frost dusting the pumpkins in the garden. Thad was already awake when Annie stepped onto the porch. He was at the woodpile, splitting hickory with steady, practiced blows. He wasn't wearing his vest now, just his thin shirt, and the steam rose off his shoulders as he worked. The pile of firewood beside him had grown impressively overnight. It was enough to last them through a week of hard frost. "You didn't have to do that," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "That wasn't part of the trade." "Wood don't split itself," he said, swinging the axe in a perfect arc. The log split with a clean crack. "And I had the energy to burn." "You worked all day yesterday," she noted, walking toward the pump. "You should be sore." He shrugged, pausing to lean on the axe handle. "Didn't sleep much." "Why? The coyote come back?" He looked at her then, his eyes bright in the morning light. "No. Too many stars. I forgot how big the sky gets when you aren't looking at it through a jail cell or a bottle." Annie felt a spark of something she hadn't felt in years. She almost smiled. She caught herself, turning to the pump to hide the softening of her face. They worked side by side that morning, though a dozen yards of grass still separated them. Annie was in the garden, her knees in the dirt as she pulled stubborn, deep-rooted weeds from the rows of winter squash. Thad was at the barn, repairing the hinge on the main door so it no longer screamed when it opened. He spoke little, and she was profoundly grateful for it. The quiet between them didn't feel like a void anymore. It felt like a shared understanding. By midday, the sun had burned off the frost and begun to beat down with a late summer vengeance. Sweat trickled down the valley of Annie's spine. She straightened slowly, one hand pressed firmly to her lower back, her breath coming in short, shallow puffs. You should rest, Annie, Thad said. He had stopped working and was watching her from the barn. I will when the weeds stop growing, she snapped, though there was no real heat in it. And they don't seem to have a sense of time. Thad studied her for a moment, the paleness of her skin, the way her hands shook. He set his tools aside and walked halfway toward the garden, stopping at the invisible line he knew he shouldn't cross. I'll finish the rows. Go sit in the shade. That wasn't the agreement, Thad Hale. You're a builder, not a gardener. Considerate interest on the biscuits, he said, his voice softening. I don't like seeing a woman work herself into the dirt. Annie narrowed her eyes. I don't like debts. They always come due with interest I can't pay. Then let me earn my keep, he insisted. No debt. Just a man with a strong back and nothing better to do. Reluctantly, she gave in. Her body was screaming for a reprieve. She sat on the porch steps, the wood cool beneath her, and watched him. He moved through the garden with surprising care, his large hands reaching around the fragile squash vines to tear away the weeds. Lila joined her on the porch, clutching a half-eaten apple, her eyes wide as she watched the giant work her mama's garden. Why does he stay outside, Mama? Lila whispered, leaning her head against Annie's arm. Doesn't he want to come in and play? Because he's polite, Lila, Annie replied, her gaze tracking the way the sun caught the gold in Thad's hair. And because some men know that a house is a private thing. Thad glanced over, his lips twitching as if he'd overheard. He didn't say a word, but the look he gave Annie was one of profound respect. Later, as the afternoon shadows began to stretch and the creek turned a deep, bruised navy, a lone rider appeared on the ridge. Annie stiffened instantly, her heart plummeting. She stood up, her hand instinctively finding the porch railing. It was Mr. Hargreave. He was a man with a sprawling spread and a soul that seemed to be made of dry rot. He reined in his horse near the new fence, his hat pulled low over his suspicious, watery eyes. He looked at the mended rails, then at Annie, and finally at Thad, who had straightened up, the hoe still in his hand. Didn't expect to see company out here, Annie, Hargreave drawled, his voice like sandpaper. I thought you were content with your solitude. Annie stepped forward to the edge of the porch, her voice clear and hard. He's help, Mr. Hargreave. Just help, Hargreave snorted, his gaze raking over Thad's scarred arms and the bruise on his face. That so? Looks like the kind of trouble that follows a man from a dark alleyway. You sure you know who you're letting onto your land? Thad didn't move. He stood as calm as still water, but there was a sudden, lethal stillness to him that made the hair on the back of Annie's neck stand up. I'll be gone soon, sir, Thad said, his voice dangerously low. Just passin' through. Hargreave's eyes lingered on him a moment longer, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. He didn't like what he saw in Thad, a man who knew how to fight back. He turned his horse, pulling the reins tight. See that you are gone. We are good, honest folk in this valley. We don't want your brand of trouble, and we certainly don't want to see someone taking advantage of a poor, defenseless widow and her young'un. I'll be keeping an eye on this place. When the sound of the horse's hooves finally faded into the distance, Annie exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her hands were trembling again. Men like him, Thad started, his voice quiet as he walked back toward the porch, stopping at the base of the steps. They don't approve of widows standin' alone. It makes them feel small. They never did, Annie replied, looking at her scarred, dirt-stained hands. They think a woman without a man is just a piece of property waiting to be claimed. Thad looked at her then, a long, searching look that seemed to see right through the armor she'd built around herself. You aren't property, Annie Carter. You're a mountain. And mountains don't belong to anyone. That night, as the sky darkened and the first cold stars began to pierce through the velvet black, Annie realized something that terrified her more than any wolf or neighbor. For the first time in 3 long, brutal years, the homestead felt held. It wasn't safe. Not yet. It wasn't healed. The scars were too deep for that. But it was watched. There was a sentinel in the barn, a man who stayed outside but whose presence filled the yard like a warm fire. And somewhere between the creek's endless, ghostly whisper and the steady, quiet breathing of a man who refused to cross her threshold, Annie felt the faintest, most dangerous stirrings in her chest. Hope. It was a terrifying thing, sharp and bright as a new blade, and she wasn't sure if she was ready for it to cut her. Chapter 3. What a man notices. Hope, Annie learned, was not loud. It didn't arrive like salvation or thunder or a man on horseback waving promises. It came quietly, like frost in the night, settling where you weren't looking, changing the shape of things before you realized it had touched you at all. It was a dangerous guest to invite into a house that had been built on the sturdy, albeit bitter, foundation of grief. The morning after she admitted it, to herself if not aloud, Annie woke with the same knot in her chest she'd carried for years. But it felt altered, not looser, not gone. Just awake. It thrummed with a low-voltage anxiety that felt less like the fear of death, and more like the fear of living. She rose before the sun, as always, careful not to wake Lila. The child slept with her thumb near her mouth, her blonde curls a tangled halo against the rough muslin pillowcase. The cabin was cold, the air sharp enough to bite. Annie wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders, the wool scratchy and familiar. She moved by instinct, stoking the stove, setting water to boil, slicing the last heel of bread into thin, apologetic pieces. She was scraping the bottom of the flour barrel, the wooden scoop screeching against the dry slats, when she heard movement outside. It wasn't the rhythmic thunk of the axe or the heavy drag of a log. It was the sound of hooves. Multiple sets, and a high, thin bleat that sounded uncannily like a crying babe. Her heart jumped into her throat. Her first thought was Hargreave. Her second was the law. She crossed to the window, her breath fogging the warped glass, and wiped a streak away with her palm. Thad was in the yard. He looked absurd. He was leading a small, stubborn-looking goat by a rope, a creature with slitted eyes and a coat the color of wet sand. The animal dug in its heels, bleating indignantly, its small hooves kicking up dust. Behind him, Thad dragged a makeshift sledge, a wooden crate lashed to two poles that clucked, rustled, and shifted with unmistakable life. Annie stared. She felt a hysterical bubble of laughter rise in her throat, quickly stifled by a wave of suspicion. She yanked the door open, the cold morning air rushing in to meet her. "What in God's name do you think you're bringing?" Thad stopped short. The rope went slack, and the goat immediately took the opportunity to nibble on his trouser leg. He looked at Annie, his face flushed from the exertion and the cold, then glanced back at the goat as if suddenly realizing the sheer spectacle of his arrival. "I can explain," he said, his voice gravelly from the morning air. "You'd better," Annie replied, stepping onto the porch. She didn't put on her boots. The cold porch boards numbed her feet, but she didn't care. "Because that looks an awful lot like livestock, and I did not agree to your livestock. We have enough mouths to feed, Thad. I won't have us starving because you wanted a pet." The goat chose that moment to rear back and headbutt Thad square in the thigh. He grunted, stumbling back a step. "Temperamental little thing. Thad." "All right," he said quickly, regaining his balance. "All right. I know this ain't what we agreed on. I know the rules of this house better than most." "You're right," Annie said, her voice hardening. "It isn't. You're a guest, a temporary one. You don't bring permanent problems to my door." He held up a calloused hand. "I didn't buy 'em for me to keep, Annie." Her eyes narrowed. The use of her name felt like a touch. "Then why are they in my yard? Why are they waking my daughter?" "Because," he said carefully, his gaze locking onto hers with an intensity that made her want to look away. "I noticed some things. I've been sitting in that barn for 2 weeks, watching the way you work. Watching the way you eat." That stopped her. She crossed her arms, tucking her hands into her armpits for warmth. "What things?" "You don't have livestock," he said simply, as if stating the weather. "Not a chicken. Not a cow. Not even a milk goat. The coop out back is a skeleton, and the paddock is grown over with weeds that'll sour a stomach. I'm aware of my own poverty, thank you. You're feedin' a growin' child beans, porridge, and bread," he went on, ignoring her bite. "I see her ribs when she's splashing in that wash basin. I see the way she looks at a piece of salt pork like it's a miracle. I do the best I can," Annie whispered, the shame hot in her cheeks. "I am one woman. I know you do. I'm not condemning you for it. God knows I've seen men with 10 times your resources do half as much." That softened her anger just a notch. Just enough to let him continue. "You take produce to town once a week. Squash, turnips, onions, when they take. You come back with flour and salt if the prices don't rob you blind. But you come back almost empty-handed more often than not because you're trading from a position of weakness." Annie felt suddenly exposed, as if he'd been reading her private ledger, counting every penny she'd hidden under the floorboards. "I went to town early," Thad said, "before the sun was even a thought. I took my last few dollars, money from before I found myself in your garden. I bought 3 laying hens. They're in the crate. Good hearty birds, feed enough to last a month if you stretch it with kitchen scraps. And this goat." He tugged the rope, and the goat let out a mournful cry. "She gives milk twice a day. Strong milk, fatty. Good for a child's bones." Annie's throat tightened so hard it ached. She looked at the crate. The chickens were white and russet, their black eyes peering through the slats. "I'm not keeping 'em here if you don't want 'em," he added quickly, sensing the shift in her. "I can sell 'em back to the Miller boy. Or take 'em with me when I go. He stopped, his jaw tightening, the bruise on his cheek turning a deep, angry plum in the light. "I saw a need, Annie. I've spent my life seeing needs and walking past. I didn't want to walk past this one." And decided to fill it. Annie said. Yes, that's not your place. I'm not taking your handouts. I'm not a charity case for a drifter with a guilty conscience. I know, he said quietly, his voice dropping an octave. That's why I'm asking, not tellin'. I'm standing here like a fool with a goat that wants to eat my coat, waiting for you to say yes or no. Silence stretched between them, thick and fragile as spun sugar. Annie looked at the goat, then at the crate, then back at the small, dark cabin behind her. She thought of Lila's pale face, the way the girl's hair had lost some of its luster over the winter. She thought of the empty egg cups in the cupboard. Lila appeared behind Annie, a small, ghost-like figure in her nightshirt, rubbing sleep from her eyes. Mama? Why is there a tiny cow in the yard? Annie didn't answer. She was watching Thad. Watching the way he kept his voice low so as not to startle the girl. The way he didn't step closer to the porch. The way he waited for her word like it was law. The goat tugged on the rope again. One of the hens clucked loudly, a domestic, comforting sound that felt 100 years old. Lila's eyes widened as she caught sight of the crate. Is that a chicken? A real one? Annie closed her eyes. She felt the weight of her pride sitting on one side of a scale, and the health of her daughter on the other. It wasn't even a contest. When she opened them, her voice was steady, but it shook just beneath the surface. You can leave them, for now. But they stay in the paddock. And the chickens stay in the coop. Thad exhaled, a long plume of white mist, relief visible in the sudden slope of his shoulders. Thank you. This doesn't change our agreement, she warned, pointing a finger at him. You don't overstay. You are still to leave soon. You don't buy your way into my house with a handful of feathers and a bleeding goat. I wouldn't try, he said, and for the first time, a ghost of a smile touched his eyes. And you don't make a habit of deciding things for me. I am the head of this homestead. I won't, he promised. She nodded once, sharp and final. The coop's gonna need buildin'. The old one is rotted through. The foxes will have those hens by midnight. If you don't fix it, I'll handle it. I saw some scrap lumber behind the barn. I didn't say you should, she countered, her old defenses flaring up. I know, he said softly. But I will. They went to market 3 days later. Annie hadn't planned on taking Thad. The market was a gauntlet of judgment she usually ran alone. She'd meant to load the cart herself, struggle with the heavy crates of winter squash, and harness Jasper with her aching fingers. But when she stepped outside at dawn, the work was already done. Thad had mended the leather harness where it had been fraying, greased the cart wheels so they didn't scream, and brushed Jasper until the old horse's coat shone like dull silver. Thad stood by the horse's head, his hand resting easily on the animal's neck. You don't have to come, Annie said, though her back already thanked him for the loaded cart. I know, you'll draw attention. People in town, they talk. They have eyes like hawks for anything different. Men already look, Annie, he replied, his voice flat. At least this way they'll look at me instead of you. She bit her lip, the truth of it stinging. She had felt like prey since Samuel died 3 years ago. Every trip to town was a series of averted eyes or lingering greasy stares from men who saw a widow as an unprotected boarder. It had been 2 weeks since Thad arrived. He was supposed to have been a memory by now, a smudge of color in the garden that faded away. But she had grown comfortable, dangerously so. Her nights were more peaceful knowing a man who could split a log in one swing was sleeping 20 yards away. The road into town was rutted and narrow, winding through scrub brush and low, rolling hills that turned gold in the morning light. Annie sat stiffly on the cart bench, the reins held tight, while Thad walked alongside. He didn't ride in the cart. He walked with a long, rhythmic stride that seemed to eat the miles without effort. He looked like he belonged to the landscape, rugged, weathered, and enduring. At the market, the air was thick with the smell of damp wool, wood smoke, and horse manure. As they pulled Jasper to a halt near the center square, Annie felt the weight of a dozen gazes. Some were curious, the town gossips peering from under their bonnets. Some were wary, the shopkeepers wondering if Thad was trouble. Some were openly hostile, men like the Miller brothers, who had once tried to buy Annie's back 40 for a pittance. Annie kept her chin up, her posture rigid as a fence post. She knew these people. She knew the labels they whispered. Widow. Alone. Easy. Thad said little. He was a silent, looming presence at her shoulder. When a merchant tried to lean too far over the cart to inspect the squash, getting uncomfortably close to Annie's space, Thad didn't say a word. He simply shifted his weight, stepping into the man's line of sight. He didn't threaten. He just was. The merchant blinked, cleared his throat, and stepped back. Thad was subtle, territorial, and entirely controlled. He never touched her. Not a hand on her elbow to guide her, not a brush of his shoulder against hers. But he was a wall between her and the world. They sold most of her produce. Not at a great price, The winter had been hard on everyone, but better than usual. The buyers didn't haggle quite as long when they had to look up at Thad's scarred, unyielding face. When it was done, Annie sat on the edge of the cart, counting her coins with fingers that shook slightly from the adrenaline of the day. It was more than she'd made in 3 months. "You did good," Thad said, leaning against the cartwheel. "So did you," she replied reluctantly. She looked at him, really looked at him in the full light of the town square. He looked less like a drifter now, and more like a man with a purpose. "Thank you, Thad." On the way back, as they passed the edge of town, Thad gestured toward a feed store. "Wait here a moment." Annie waited, her jaw clenched, watching the door. A few minutes later, he emerged with a heavy sack of grain slung over his shoulder. "I paid for it," he said before she could protest. "Out of what I earned mending that fence for the blacksmith while you were at the weaver's." She studied him, the suspicion returning. "You're pushing, Thad. You're trying to build a nest here." "I'm holding back," he corrected, his voice low and raspy. He threw the grain into the back of the cart. "If I were pushing, Annie, you'd know it." That night, he didn't return with the cart. He told her he had an errand, to run in the woods near the creek. He returned at dusk, a dark silhouette against the purple-hued sky. He was carrying a buck over his shoulders, the animal's head lolling, its antlers casting strange, skeletal shadows on the ground. Annie stood on the porch, her hands tucked into her apron. She stared at the animal, the blood dark and tacky against its hide. "I noticed something else," Thad said, his breath hitching slightly from the weight as he set the deer down carefully on a clean patch of grass. "You don't eat meat. Not since I've been here. Just that salt pork for the girl. I can't afford to waste lead on hunting. And I can't afford the butcher," she admitted, her voice small. "You can now. This'll last you and the girl through the first thaw, if we smoke it right." She swallowed hard, her eyes stinging. The kindness of it was almost harder to bear than the hardship. "You didn't have to do this. You've done enough." "I wanted to," he said simply. He spent the next 2 hours under the light of a tin lantern, skinning the deer. He was clean and efficient, his movements practiced and respectful of the animal. He didn't make a mess. He worked with a quiet intensity that was almost hypnotic to watch. When he was finished, he offered her the choice cuts, wrapped carefully in clean cloth he'd asked for earlier. Lila watched from the porch, her small face pressed against the railing. "Is that dinner, Mama?" "Yes," Annie said, her voice hoarse with a sudden, overwhelming gratitude. "For a long while, baby." That night, the cabin was transformed. As Annie cooked a venison stew, thick with the last of the onions, carrots, and the rich, dark meat, the room filled with a scent she hadn't known since Samuel was alive. It was the smell of security. It was warm, nourishing, and heavy, with the promise of a full stomach. Thad ate in the barn, as always. Annie had offered him a bowl, but he had taken it with a nod and retreated into the shadows of the hayloft. He knew the boundary. He didn't cross it. Annie sat at the small wooden table, watching the firelight flicker over her daughter's face. Lila was eating with a gusto she hadn't shown in months, her small spoon clacking against the tin plate. Annie felt something shift in her chest, a final, stubborn plate of ice breaking apart. Thad did not cross her threshold. He didn't sit in Samuel's chair. He didn't touch her hair or offer sweet words. But he was everywhere. He was in the eggs, warm and smooth in her hands each morning. He was in the goat's steady, rich milk that made Lila's cheeks go pink. He was in the mountain of split wood that reached higher than her head. He was in the meat hanging cool and dark in the shed. He was restraint made flesh. He was a storm that had decided to be a breeze, a predator that had decided to be a guardian. And Annie Carter, looking out at the dark silhouette of the barn against the stars, realized she had never been more afraid. Not of a man who would hurt her, but of a man who knew exactly how to make her want him to stay. Chapter 4. What the Creek Remembers. The creek changed its voice at night. By day it was companionable, water slipping over stone, a steady, unthinking sound that Annie had learned to live beside, like the ticking of a clock or the rhythm of her own breath. But by night, when the sun dipped behind the jagged spine of the horizon and the world turned to charcoal and ink, the water spoke in another register entirely. Lower, older. It pulled at the darkness, whispering things the living preferred not to hear. Secrets of the silt, the cold weight of the past, and the slow, inevitable erosion of all things. Annie stood on the porch long after the lamps were extinguished, the wood cool beneath her bare feet. The air was thick, with the scent of damp earth, and the lingering, sweet musk of the venison Thad had brought in. Across the yard, Thad's silhouette was a darker shape against the darker barn. He was sitting on a crate, sharpening his knife. The soft, rhythmic rasp hiss of metal against stone carried faintly through the air, a sound so steady it felt like a heartbeat. It was a practical sound. An honest one. But tonight, it set her nerves on edge. It sounded like preparation. It sounded like a man honing an edge for a task he hadn't yet named. She had not slept well since the way the homestead had begun, quietly, to fill with the sounds of life, eggs clicking against each other in her apron pocket, the frothy ping of milk hitting the bottom of a tin pail, Lila's laughter, which now carried farther than it had in years, ringing out across the garden where she followed Thad like a shadow. These things should have eased her. Instead, they made her wary. Annie had learned the hard way that abundance was a debt, and safety was merely a lull between storms. Thad noticed things. He noticed when the smokehouse door sagged and fixed it without being asked, his large hands moving with a grace that belied their strength. He noticed when the gate latch caught wrong and adjusted it with 2 taps of a hammer, his brow furrowed in concentration. Most of all, he noticed her. Earlier that afternoon, she had reached for a heavy water bucket, her muscles protesting with a sharp wince she thought she'd hidden. Wordlessly, Thad had stepped in, his arm brushing hers as he took the handle. The contact was brief, a fleeting slide of warm, rough skin against her own, but it sent a jolt through her that lingered long after he'd walked away. His heat stayed on her skin, a phantom limb. He noticed, and he restrained himself. That, more than anything, unsettled her. Men like Samuel had noticed things too, once. Not needs, exactly. Weaknesses, places to press until something gave. Samuel had looked at her and seen a vessel to be filled, or a spirit to be bent. Thad looked at her and saw her. He saw the way she held her breath when she was worried. He saw the way she favored her left side when the rain was coming. It made her feel seen in a way that had nothing to do with ownership. It was an intimacy of observation, and it terrified her more than any threat. The next morning broke hard and bright, the sun a pale, unforgiving eye in the sky. Annie was in the smokehouse, hanging long, salt-cured strips of venison. The air inside was dim and fragrant with hickory. She heard hoofbeats. Just one horse, moving at a lazy, familiar pace that made the hair on her arms stand up, her hand stilled on a hook. She knew that rhythm. It was a heavy, arrogant trot. Hargreave reined in near the fence. He didn't dismount. He sat atop his bay, looking down at the homestead with a proprietary air. His horse's flank was lathered, and Hargreave's expression was pinched with a thin, sour satisfaction. His gaze moved immediately to the smokehouse, then to the new chickens scratching near the coop, and finally to the goat tethered beneath the cottonwood. "Well," he said, his voice carrying like a rasp. "Looks like prosperity found you after all, Mrs. Carter. I didn't think this dirt had any miracles left in it." Annie stepped out of the smokehouse, wiping her hands on her apron, her chin tilting up. She saw Thad emerge from the barn. He didn't rush. He moved slow and deliberate, his presence shifting the air like an approaching storm. He stopped well short of the porch, his hand resting near his belt, his eyes fixed on the man on the horse. "What do you want, Mr. Hargreave?" Annie asked, her voice tight. Hargreave smiled thinly. "Just checking on a neighbor. Town's been talking, you see. Word travels fast when a widow starts stocking up on livestock she can't afford." "The town can mind its own business," Annie snapped. "Oh, it's more than business," Hargreave replied. His eyes flicked to Thad, lingering on the breadth of his shoulders, the scar on his face. "It's about how quickly things can change. About the kind of men a woman keeps when she's got something worth taking." Annie felt the old, hot anger rise in her throat. "You're trespassing, Hargreave. My taxes are paid, and my gate is closed." "So I am." He tipped his hat, a gesture that felt like a threat. "Just thought you might like to know. People remember things around here. Dead Man's Crossing remembers." Thad stiffened. It was a minute movement, a tightening of the jaw, a sudden stillness in his hands, but Annie noticed. It was the stillness of a man who had just seen a ghost. Hargreave's smile sharpened, his teeth yellow in the sun. Funny place, that saloon. Lot of history in its floorboards. Lot of blood, too, if you dig deep enough. "Leave," Annie said, her heart hammering against her ribs. Hargreave pulled on the reins, turning his horse. Truth has a way of surfacing, Annie. Just like a body in the spring thaw. The creek seized to that. The dust from his horse hadn't yet settled when Annie turned on Thad. He was still standing there, staring at the spot where Hargreave had been, his face a mask of pale granite. "What was that?" she demanded. "Just a man enjoying the sound of his own voice," Thad said, but the gravel in his tone gave him away. "That wasn't nothing," she replied, stepping toward him. "You went still. Men don't go that still for nothing. What is Dead Man's Crossing to you?" Thad looked at her for a long moment. The silence between them grew heavy, filled with the hum of insects and the distant, mocking call of a crow. Then he nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement. "I owe you a conversation." The weight in her stomach dropped, turning cold as lead. "About what?" "Tonight," he said. "When the girl's asleep. When there's no one but us and the water." The day passed under a gathering weight. Annie moved through her chores like a woman underwater. Every sound was muffled, the clack of the loom, the slosh of the laundry, every thought dragging behind her. Lila, oblivious to the tension, chattered happily as she trailed Thad. He was mending a section of the back fence, and Lila was helping by handing him nails. Annie watched them from the kitchen window. She saw the way Thad bent down to listen to the child, his rough face softening in a way he never allowed when Annie was looking directly at him. She saw the strength in his arms as he drove the post into the ground. She had learned, after Samuel, to recognize the shape of endings. This felt like the sharp edge of a cliff. That night, after Lila was tucked into bed and the cabin was silent save for the pop of the cooling stove, Annie stepped onto the porch. Thad was already there. He wasn't sitting. He stood by the railing, his hat in his hands, his shoulders squared like a man bracing for a lash. The moon was a sliver of bone in the sky, casting long, distorted shadows across the yard. The creek was loud tonight, a frantic, rushing sound. "The creek," Thad said without preamble. "That's where it happened, just 5 miles up, where the crossing used to be." Annie's breath caught. She leaned against the doorframe, her legs feeling suddenly hollow. "Dead Man's Crossing," Thad continued, his voice low and hollow. 3 years ago. Winter just breaking. The ice was still on the edges of the water, sharp as glass. Annie sank onto the porch step, her skirts rustling. She didn't tell him to stop. She didn't think she could speak if she tried. "There was a bar fight," Thad said. He was looking out into the dark, his eyes unfocused. "The kind that starts loud and ends ugly. It was over a game, or a word, or maybe just the whiskey. A man named Samuel Carter was there. He was beating another man senseless. A boy, really. No one stepped in. Everyone was too scared, or too drunk to care." Annie's hands curled into fists in her lap. She could picture it. She knew Samuel's rage, how it was a blind, suffocating thing that didn't stop until there was silence. "I did," Thad said. "I stepped in. I was just passing through, looking for work. I saw what he was doing, and I couldn't walk past. I pulled him back. I'm a big man, Annie. I don't always know my own strength when the blood is up. I pulled him back, harder than I meant to." He stopped. The sound of the creek seemed to swell, filling the gap in his story. "He slipped," Thad said, his voice barely a whisper. "The floor was wet. He went back, and he hit his head on the edge of the heavy oak bar. It made a sound, like a branch breaking in the frost. It was over before anyone realized what had happened." The words hung between them, heavy and final, like stones dropped into a deep well. "I didn't know his name then," Thad said, finally turning to look at her. His eyes were bare, stripped of all defense. "Didn't know he had a homestead. Didn't know he had a wife, a child who looked just like him, but with none of the poison." Annie stood up slowly. Her body felt strangely light, as if she were floating away from the porch. The world narrowed to a single roaring point. "You killed my husband," she said. It wasn't a question. It was a cold, hard fact. "I stopped him," Thad replied, his voice steady despite the pain in it. "But yes, he died because of my hand. The law called it an accident. No one in that bar blamed me. They even thanked me." Annie laughed once, a sharp, broken sound that turned into a sob she choked back. "Do you know how many times I imagined that night? How many ways I thought he might have died? I thought he'd fallen in a ditch. I thought he'd run off with a girl from the saloon. I thought he'd finally just found someone meaner than him." He swallowed, his Adam's apple moving convulsively. "I know." "No," she said, her voice rising. "You don't. You don't know the years I spent waiting for the other shoe to drop, waiting for him to walk through that door and finish what he started with me." She paced the length of the porch, her hands in her hair, her breath coming too fast. The air felt too thin to breathe. "I waited for him. All night. I had the bruises on my ribs to remember him by. I thought he'd come home drunk and angry because he'd lost his money. I thought," her voice broke. She pressed her palm to her mouth, her eyes burning. "I'm sorry," Thad said. It wasn't a plea for forgiveness. It was a simple, devastating truth. "I am so sorry, Annie. You should have told me the day you walked into my garden," she whispered. "I wanted to," he said. "Every day I spent mending your fence, every time I looked at Lila, I wanted to scream it. But I didn't want to be just another man who decided when you could handle the truth. I wanted to give you a choice. I wanted to make up for the hole I left, even if I couldn't fill it." She turned on him then, her eyes blazing with a mixture of fury and a terrifying newfound grief. "So you waited until I trusted you? Until I let you near my daughter? Until I started to feel things I haven't felt in a lifetime?" "Yes," he said, his voice cracking. Silence fell. thick and suffocating. The creek whispered on, indifferent to the lives breaking on its banks. Annie looked at him, this man who had brought her eggs and milk, who had protected her from Hargreave, who had killed the man who had been her slow-motion executioner. She felt a wave of sensuality she couldn't suppress, a dark, tangled desire for the hands that had both ended her torment and built her a future. It was a sickening, electric pull. She wanted to strike him, and she wanted to hold him until the world ended. She stepped closer to him, her breath hitching. The heat radiating from him was a physical force. In the shadows she could see the pulse jumping in his neck. "Why stay?" she asked, her voice a ragged thread. "Why stay after you knew who I was?" Thad looked at her, his gaze dropping to her mouth for a fraction of a second before meeting her eyes again. "Because I couldn't walk away twice, Annie. I saw you through that window that first night, and I saw a woman who was holding onto the world by a thread. I realized I was the one who had frayed it. I had to stay until I knew it wouldn't break." She sank back onto the porch step, her body shaking with a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. Samuel's face rose unbidden in her mind, the red, bloated face of a man who loved power more than people. She remembered the weight of his hand on her arm, the way he would smell of cheap rye and stale tobacco. And then she looked at Thad, who smelled of cedar and rain and honest sweat. Thad had ended that man. Whether it was an accident or an act of mercy from the universe, the truth was a knot too complex to untangle. He had saved her, and he had ruined her. "I don't know what to do with this," Annie said, her voice small. "You don't have to decide tonight," Thad replied. He stepped off the porch, his boots crunching in the dirt. "I'll go if you want. I should have already. I'll leave the livestock. They're yours." She looked out toward the barn, now a place of safety rather than a prison. She looked at the coop, the smokehouse, the life that had begun to return to the dust. "No," she said at last, the word torn from her. "You don't get to decide that either. You don't get to leave me again." He stopped, his back to her, his head bowed. Fair. They sat there in the darkness, the space between them, vibrating with all the things they couldn't say. Somewhere in the dark, the creek kept watch, its cold water flowing over the stones, remembering the blood and the history of Dead Man's Crossing. It remembered everything, but for the first time in 3 years, Annie Carter was starting to forget the sound of her husband's voice. Chapter 5. The Shape of Staying. Morning came without asking permission. It slid into the valley on a pale wash of light, softening the hard lines of night without quite erasing them. The fog clung low to the creek, a thin, gauzy veil that moved like breath across the water, curling around the base of the cottonwoods. Birds began their tentative calls, testing the day as if unsure it deserved their voices. Annie had not slept. She lay awake in the narrow bed, staring at the ceiling beams, until the rough-hewn timber blurred into something abstract and shifting. Every sound was magnified in the silence. The rhythmic creak of the house settling, the distant obsidian murmur of the creek, and the slow, steady rise and fall of Lila's breathing in the next room. She listened for Thad's footsteps and heard none. No boards groaned under his weight. No door opened or closed. He had kept his word. He had stayed exactly where she had left him, anchored in the darkness of the barn. That, more than anything, unsettled her. His restraint was a physical presence that seemed to leak through the walls of the cabin, a silent, vibrating chord that hummed against her skin. She rose before the sun had fully cleared the ridge, pulling on her dress with movements that felt borrowed. Her body was here, performing its tasks out of long habit, but her mind lagged behind, snagged on the jagged edges of a truth she couldn't yet smooth over. The porch was empty. His bedroll was gone from its usual place near the barn, but the barn door itself stood open, not abandoned, but beckoning. "Stay," she had said. It hadn't been an act of forgiveness. It had been an act of survival, or perhaps a desperate need to see if a man could actually be what he claimed to be. She wasn't sure yet whether that command was mercy for him or a slow-burning punishment for herself. Inside the barn, the air was cool and smelled of dry Timothy hay, old leather, and the faint, metallic tang of iron. Thad worked in the center of the floor, his back to her. He was repairing a split rail, his movements economical and deliberate. He had stripped down to his undershirt, and the muscles in his back moved like shifting stones beneath the fabric. He did not turn when she entered, but she saw the way his hands stilled for a fraction of a second before resuming their work. He knew the weight of her gaze. He knew the scent of her skin. "Morning," she said. Her voice sounded strange, thin and stretched, as if it had traveled a long distance to reach the present. "Morning," he replied. Just that. No apology, no attempt to fill the space between them with words that would only bruise. She leaned against a post, folding her arms tightly across her chest. She watched the way he handled the wood, firm but not forceful, precise but not rigid. Her body betrayed her with a sharp, unwelcome awareness. She remembered the heat of him on the porch, the way his proximity had felt like a low-voltage current. Even now, Through the layers of her clothing and the dust of the barn, she felt a pull toward him that was both terrifying and intoxicating. It was a sensual gravity, a dark magnetism born of shared secrets, and the blood on his hands. The blood that had, in a cruel twist of fate, bought her freedom. "I'll take Lila to the creek later," Annie said, trying to anchor herself in the mundane. "She likes to look for those flat stones near the bend." Thad nodded, still focused on the rail. "I'll be in the north pasture. Fence line needs checkin'. Some posts are looking soft." It was a conversation stripped to the bone, and yet every syllable was thick with the unsaid. She watched a bead of sweat track down the side of his neck, disappearing into the collar of his shirt. Her fingers twitched with a sudden, maddening urge to follow that path, to touch the skin of the man who had ended her nightmare and begun a new one. She turned away before he could look up and catch the hunger in her eyes. The house felt different with the daylight in it. Not lighter, just exposed. Annie moved through the kitchen on instinct, setting water to boil. Lila patted in half awake, her hair a golden tangle. "Is Thad still here?" Lila asked, rubbing her eyes. "Yes," Annie said, her heart doing a strange, fluttering skip. "He's working." Lila nodded, satisfied, and climbed onto her stool. Children loved without context. They accepted the man who fixed their toys and brought them milk without asking about the ghosts that followed him. Annie envied her that simplicity. To Lila, Thad was a hero. To Annie, he was a savior who wore the face of a killer. After breakfast, the heat began to settle over the valley, thick and humming. Annie took Lila down to the creek. The path was worn smooth, the earth packed hard. The water was lower now, revealing smooth, prehistoric stones and the dark, slick shapes of submerged roots. Lila crouched near the bank, intent on her task, while Annie sat on a fallen log. This water had seen it. Dead Man's Crossing was upstream, just a few miles as the crow flies. She imagined the winter ice along the edges back then, sharp, glass-like shards. She imagined the floor of the saloon, slick with spilled whiskey, and the mud of 100 boots. She imagined the sound Thad had described, the crack of bone against oak. She pressed her fingers into the rough bark of the log, grounding herself against the dizzying swirl of the past. Samuel had always come home angry. She could still feel the phantom weight of his hand on her shoulder, the way his voice would drop into a low, menacing growl before the first blow landed. He had been a man who needed to break things to feel whole. And then, he had simply stopped. She remembered the months of silence that followed his disappearance. She had thought she was waiting for him to return and finish her. She hadn't realized she was already free, paid for by a stranger's intervention. "Mama, look," Lila called, holding up a stone. "This one looks like a heart." Annie stood and crossed to her daughter, crouching in the damp silt. The stone was pale and smooth, rounded perfectly on one side. "It does," Annie said, her voice catching. "You should keep it, Lila. Put it in your pocket." As she stood, she caught her reflection in a still pool near the bank. She looked older, her face lined with a fatigue that went deeper than sleep. But there was something else, too, a spark of something she hadn't seen in years. A defiance. A life. Hargreave came back 2 days later. He didn't bother with the facade of a neighborly visit this time. He rode in hard, his horse's hooves kicking up a choking screen of dust. Annie saw him from the window and felt the familiar, cold, tightening in her chest. Thad was in the pasture, hammer in hand. He looked up, his body going alert in that dangerous, predatory stillness that Annie was beginning to understand. It wasn't the stillness of a bully, it was the stillness of a shield. Annie stepped onto the porch before Hargreave could dismount. "You're trespassing, Mr. Hargreave," she said, her voice ringing out in the heat. Hargreave smiled, a slow, yellowed expression that never reached his eyes. "You said that last time, Annie. It's getting to be a habit with you." "It's a habit because you don't seem to hear well," she replied. Hargreave's gaze slid past her to Thad, who was walking toward them, his hammer held loosely at his side. "Funny thing about land," Hargreave mused, wiping sweat from his brow. "Sometimes the past has a way of staking a claim on it, no matter how many fences you build." Thad stopped at the edge of the porch, his presence shifting the gravity of the yard. "Say what you're here to say, Hargreave." "The sun's too hot for riddles." Hargreave's eyes narrowed. "The sheriff's been asking questions in town. Old questions. About a night at the crossing 3 years back. Seems someone's memory got jogged by seeing a certain scarred face around here." Annie felt the world tilt. Her hand moved instinctively to the porch railing to steady herself. "You don't know anything," she said. But her voice lacked its earlier steel. "I know enough to make life very difficult for a man with a history," Hargreave said. He leaned forward over his saddle horn, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial hiss. "Accidents don't always stay accidents, Thad. Not when there's a widow involved. People start talking about motives. They start talking about how a man might kill a husband just to get his hands on the wife and the land." The air went dead silent. The implication was a foul thing, hanging in the heat. Annie felt a surge of nausea, followed immediately by a white-hot flash of protective rage. "Get off my property," Annie whispered. "Now," Hargreave laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "I'm just looking out for the community, Annie. A woman alone, she's vulnerable. She might not see the wolf for the sheepskin." Thad took a step toward the horse. It wasn't a fast move, but it was so filled with suppressed violence that the bay horse whinnied and stepped back. "Go," Thad said. It wasn't a shout. It was a command that seemed to vibrate in the very marrow of Annie's bones. Hargreave's bravado flickered for a second. He pulled on the reins, turning his horse. The truth has a way of surrendering itself, one way or another. "I'll be seeing you, Annie, soon." He galloped away, leaving a plume of red dust that tasted like copper. That night, the heat didn't break. The air was thick and syrupy, smelling of parched grass and the coming rain that refused to fall. Annie sat at the table long after Lila had drifted off. She didn't light the lamp. She sat in the silver-gray gloom, watching the moths beat themselves against the window screen. She found Thad at the edge of the property, where the trees began their descent toward the creek. He was leaning against a fence post, staring into the dark. "They're going to come for you," she said, her voice barely audible over the rush of the water. "They already are," he replied. He didn't turn around. She stepped closer, the grass whispering against the hem of her skirts. As she approached, the scent of him hit her, salt, wood smoke, and something deeply masculine and warm. The tension between them was no longer just about the secret. It was about the way their bodies seemed to recognize each other in the dark. It was a sensual pressure, an ache that demanded to be acknowledged. "You could leave," she said, "before Hargreave talks the sheriff into a lynch mob." "I told you," Thad said, finally turning to face her. His eyes were dark pits in the moonlight. "I won't walk away again. I've spent 3 years running from that night. I'm tired, Annie. I'm so tired of being a ghost." She reached out, her fingers grazing the rough sleeve of his shirt. The contact sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the night air. She moved her hand up, her palm coming to rest against the warm, solid breadth of his chest. Beneath the fabric, his heart was a drum, steady and powerful. "If this destroys us," she whispered, her eyes searching his, "I don't know if I can survive it. I've only just started to breathe again." Thad looked at her then, really looked at her. He reached up, his large, calloused hand cupping the side of her face. His thumb traced the line of her jaw with a tenderness that made her breath hitch. "I'm not here to destroy you, Annie," he said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to settle in her chest. "I'm here to stand in front of whatever tries." He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. The intimacy was staggering. She could feel his breath on her lips, taste the heat of him. For a moment, the world, the creek, the ghosts, the threat of Hargreave ceased to exist. There was only the pressure of his hand against her skin, and the terrifying, beautiful possibility of belonging to someone who didn't want to break her. She closed her eyes, leaning into him. The shape of staying was not a simple thing. It was jagged and heavy, filled with risk and the scent of old blood. But as Thad's arm moved around her waist, pulling her flush against the hard planes of his body, Annie realized she didn't want the easy path. She wanted the man who stood between her and the dark. The creek murmured beside them, carrying its memories downstream, indifferent and eternal. Staying was not the same as healing, but as she stood there in his arms, Annie realized it was a shape she could finally begin to learn. Chapter 6. What the Dark Demands. The rain came before dawn. It did not arrive as a gentle mercy to cool the parched valley floor. Instead, it descended in a hard, slanting downpour that rattled the cedar shingles of the roof like 1,000 frantic fingers. The heat that had sat heavy and stagnant for weeks was driven out in a sudden, violent sweep of cold air. Thunder rolled low through the valley, a tectonic grumble that shook the very foundations of the cabin, vibrating through the floorboards and into Annie's bones. She woke with a start, her heart already racing, her skin prickling as if her body had sensed the atmospheric shift long before her mind could catch up. For a moment, she lay perfectly still in the gray, watery light of the room, listening. The creek, usually a rhythmic companion, had transformed. Its voice had risen to an urgent, restless roar, water slapping against stone, branches cracking loose along the bank and being swept away. The land was drinking deeply, greedily, and yet it seemed it could not swallow fast enough. Annie pushed herself upright, the movement slow and heavy. She wrapped her quilt around her shoulders, the wool scratching against her collarbone. The space beside her was empty. She hadn't expected otherwise. Thad had stayed in the barn since the night he'd confessed the truth, keeping the distance she hadn't explicitly asked for, but which they both understood was necessary. Still, the absence landed sharp and immediate, a hollow ache in the center of her chest that felt like a bruise pressed too soon. Crossing the cabin quietly, she checked on Lila. Her daughter was a small, soft curve beneath her blankets, thumb tucked beneath her chin, oblivious to the storm clawing at the world outside. Annie lingered in the doorway, watching the steady, fragile rise and fall of the girl's chest. For years, this had been her anchor, this one small, fierce reason to endure the unendurable. She closed the door softly and stepped into the main room. Thad was there. He stood near the window, shirtless, the sculpted planes of his back illuminated by a sudden flicker of lightning. He was watching the rain turn the yard into a shifting sheet of silver and shadow. His boots were already on, his belt buckled, his posture that of a man who hadn't slept at all, a man waiting for the blow he knew was coming. Annie stopped, her breath hitching. In the half-light, the scars on his back, remnants of a life lived in the teeth of hard winds, looked like a map of a territory she was only just beginning to explore. Neither of them spoke. The storm filled the silence for them, a deafening white noise that made the small cabin feel like a raft lost at sea. "You should be resting," she said finally, her voice barely carrying over the thunder. "So should you." His voice was rougher than usual, worn down to something raw and elemental. He turned then, slowly, as if moving too fast might shatter the fragile truce they had built under the moonlight. In the dim, blue-gray light, the tension was written into the set of his jaw and the hollows beneath his eyes. He looked older. He looked like the man from Dead Man's Crossing, the one who had seen the worst of humanity and decided to stand against it. "I heard the rain," she said, stepping further into the room. "The creek's rising faster than I've seen it in years." He nodded, his gaze returning to the window. "It'll flood the low bend by noon. The banks are already soft." That bend. The thought passed between them without needing to be named. Dead Man's Crossing, the place where Samuel had died and Thad had become a ghost. The rising water felt like the past physically surging upward, threatening to overflow its banks and drown them both. "I should check the animals," he said, reaching for his shirt. "The coop might flood if the runoff pools behind the barn." Annie didn't hesitate. "I'll come with you." He paused, one arm in a sleeve, studying her face. "You don't have to, Annie. Stay in the dry." "I know I don't have to," she said, her voice gaining a sudden, sharp clarity. "I want to." That seemed to settle something in him, a minute relaxation of his shoulders. He grabbed his heavy oilskin jacket and held it out for her. She took it, shrugging into the oversized garment. It was warm from his body and smelled intensely of him, cedar smoke, rain, and the faint, clean tang of lye soap. The scent curled low in her belly, a physical pull that was as unwelcome as it was undeniable. Outside, the world had been stripped down to its most brutal essentials. The rain was a physical weight, blurring the edges of the horizon and turning the familiar fences into jagged, dark lines. Mud sucked at their boots with a wet, gasping sound as they crossed the yard. Thad moved ahead of her, his large frame cutting through the wind, instinctively positioning himself between Annie and the open, treacherous land. He was a shield, she realized. He had always been a shield. They worked without words, a coordinated dance of necessity. They moved the panicked chickens to the higher loft of the barn, secured the goat who was bleating in a high, shrill register, and hauled heavy stones to reinforce the low fence where the runoff was already carving deep, muddy channels. Inside the barn, the air was thick with the scent of wet wool and nervous animals. Annie held the lantern, its flame flickering violently in the drafts, while Thad wrestled a heavy door back onto its rusted hinges. She watched the muscles in his arms bunch and cord, rain slicking his skin into a bronze sheen. Every heave of his chest, every grunt of effort, felt intimate. She wasn't looking at a hero or a villain. She was looking at a man who had stepped into the path of violence once to save her, and was now standing in the path of a storm to save what they had built. When the last bolt was slid home, they stood together under the barn's deep overhang. The rain hammered down in deafening sheets just inches from their toes. "You shouldn't be here when the sheriff comes," Annie said, her voice trembling slightly from the cold. Thad wiped a mix of sweat and rainwater from his brow with the heel of his hand. "If he comes, he will," she insisted. "Hargreave won't stop now. He's the kind of man who needs to see things broken, to feel powerful." "He's tasted blood, Thad." Thad exhaled, a long, slow breath that misted in the chilly air. "I won't run, Annie. I told you that. I'm done with the shadows." "I know," she said, looking at the way the water ran down the deep scar on his cheek. "That doesn't mean I have to like watching the world try to take you." A corner of his mouth twitched, not a smile, but a recognition of her words. "Annie," he said, and her name sounded different in the rain. It sounded like a prayer and a plea at the same time. "If this turns bad, if they come for me." "No," she cut in, her hand reaching out to grip his forearm. His skin was burning hot despite the rain. "Don't say it. I need you to hear it," he said, his gaze pinning her to the spot. "If it comes down to me or you and Lila, there is no choice. I won't let you be collateral for what I did. I won't have your life ruined twice by the same man's ghost. Her chest tightened so hard she could barely breathe. You don't get to decide who I lose, Thad. Not anymore. That's the thing about storms, he whispered, leaning closer until the heat of him pushed back the chill of the rain. They decide anyway. The rain eased by late afternoon, leaving the valley steaming and raw. The creek had swelled into a dark, churning beast, its banks restless, water gnawing at the roots of the cottonwoods as if testing their resolve. By evening, the sheriff came. He didn't come with a posse or the fanfare Hargreave would have wanted. He rode in, slow, alone, his horse picking its way carefully through the softened ground. Annie saw him from the porch and felt her spine go rigid. Thad appeared from the side of the house, his hand resting habitually near the heavy hammer at his belt. He didn't hide. He stood in the open, waiting. The sheriff dismounted, his joints creaking. He was a thin man, his face a map of weary lines, his eyes the color of cold ash. He looked like a man who had seen too much truth to believe in easy justice. Mrs. Carter, he said, tipping his hat. Evenin', Sheriff, Annie replied, her voice steady. His gaze flicked to Thad, staying there for a long, measuring moment. Mind if I speak with you, Annie? Privately? Say what you have to say right here, Annie said, stepping down from the porch to stand beside Thad. The movement was deliberate. A claim, the sheriff sighed, a sound of profound exhaustion. There's been talk in town. Hargreave is stirring the pot, claimin' there was more to your husband's death than a simple accident. Claimin' this man here was the one who did it. Silence pressed in on them. Even the roar of the creek seemed to fade into the background. Annie stepped forward, her chin lifted. My husband was a violent, miserable man, Sheriff. You know that. Half the town knew that. He beat me until I couldn't walk. He would have killed someone that night at the crossing if he hadn't been stopped. He was a man looking for a grave, and he found it. The sheriff's brow furrowed. The law is a particular thing, Annie. If a man dies at another's hand, I'm saying, Annie interrupted, her voice ringing out across the yard, that whatever happened at that saloon saved my life. And likely the lives of others. If you're looking for a criminal, you're 3 years too late. He's already buried in the churchyard. The sheriff looked at Thad again. You have anything to add to that? Thad met his gaze, unflinching. I didn't run then, because I wanted to hide. I ran because I didn't think anyone would care why it happened. But I'm here now. And I won't leave this land. The sheriff looked from Thad to Annie, seeing the way she stood, not like a victim, but like a woman who had finally found her footing. He looked at the well-repaired fences, the sturdy barn, the signs of a life being rebuilt from the wreckage. Hargreave wants this land, the sheriff said quietly. But he doesn't have a badge, and as long as I do, there won't be a mob. Not on my watch. But there will be an inquiry, Thad. You'll have to come to town and answer to the circuit judge when he passes through. I'll be there, Thad said. The sheriff nodded, remounted his horse, and turned back toward the road. As he rode away, the valley felt changed, scarred by the revelation, but still standing. Night fell quietly, the sky clearing to reveal a jagged, brilliant moon. Inside the cabin, the air was still cool from the rain. Lila was asleep, the heart-shaped stone tucked safely under her pillow. Annie stood at the window, watching the moonlight break through the last of the clouds, turning the swollen creek into a ribbon of hammered silver. She heard the floorboard creak. Thad came up behind her. He didn't touch her, but he was close enough that she could feel the radiant heat of his body. Come to bed, Annie, he said softly. It wasn't a command. It was a gentle offering of peace. She turned to face him. The tension that had defined their relationship, the secrets, the fear, the mourning, seemed to have been washed away by the storm. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, two people who had survived the dark and were standing, blinking in the light. Annie reached for him. This time, there was no hesitation, no ghost of Samuel between them. When he took her into his arms, it felt like coming home after a very long war. He kissed her with a slow, reverent intensity, his hands framing her face as if she were something precious and fragile. She kissed him back with a hunger that surprised her, a deep, visceral need born of choice. She wasn't holding on to him because she needed a protector. She was holding on because she wanted the man. The dark had demanded much from them. It had taken their peace, their names, and their secrets. But as they moved together in the quiet of the cabin, Annie felt a strength she hadn't known she possessed. The shape of staying was no longer a mystery. It was this. It was standing together when the water rose, and finding a way to love the man who had survived the storm. Chapter 7. What the water carries away. The creek receded slowly. It did not rush back into its narrow bed, as if ashamed of its violence. It lingered instead, swollen and dark for days after the storm, a reminder that some forces could not be commanded, only endured. The water carried debris downstream, broken branches, torn reeds, The remnants of old things loosened from the banks. And with each passing hour, it carried something else too. Wait. Memory. The long, heavy residue of what had been. Annie watched it every morning from the porch, a cup of coffee warming her palms. The air was crisp now, scrubbed clean by the deluge. The world felt newer, sharper, as if the silt and grime of the last 3 years had been scrubbed away by the very flood she had feared. She stood at the same bend just past the cottonwoods, the place where the land dipped and the water slowed, smoothing itself into a deceptive calm. Mist still rose at dawn, curling low and pale over the surface. It felt like a boundary between what had been and what might still be possible. Behind her, the homestead breathed. There was a rhythm to it now, a steady heartbeat that hadn't existed when she lived here, in a state of perpetual flinching. There was the soft, rhythmic thud of the barn door opening, the low, contented murmur of the goats, the sound of a hammer striking wood, not in frantic, desperate repair, but in steady, purposeful construction. Thad was rebuilding the smokehouse roof, replacing the rot Samuel had ignored with clean, fragrant boards of new pine. He worked with the patience of a man no longer running from the future, but building a home within it. Lila sat in the dirt nearby, the damp earth staining her apron. She was arranging stones in careful rows, whispering to them as if they were a congregation. The heart-shaped stone stayed in her pocket, a talisman she touched often, a reminder that even the hardest things could be shaped by the water into something beautiful. Annie turned from the creek and watched them together. There was no fear in her chest anymore when she saw Thad with her daughter. No tightening of the throat, no instinctive calculation of the nearest exit, only a quiet, unfolding certainty. Lila laughed easily around him, a sound like silver bells. She climbed his long legs like he was a piece of familiar, sturdy furniture, and she handed him nails with the solemn importance of a high priestess. Thad accepted it all with a quiet reverence, as if love, once offered, was not something to be questioned or tested, but honored with every strike of his hammer. That was how he stayed. Not with a grand proclamation, but with 1,000 small, steady acts of presence. The inquiry in town came and went with surprisingly little drama. Thad rode into the settlement alone, his back straight, his head unbowed. He didn't wear the look of a man seeking a pardon. He wore the look of a man presenting the truth as a finished thing. Annie had wanted to go with him, but he had placed a hand on her shoulder and told her, "Let me settle this debt on my own, Annie. I want to come back to you with a clean slate." The circuit judge was a man named Miller, a veteran of the bench, who looked like he was carved from the same granite as the mountains. He listened. Witnesses spoke. Men from the saloon who had once been too afraid or too drunk to intervene, now sober and older and burdened by the heavy weight of hindsight. They spoke of Samuel Carter's fists, his mouth full of bile and senseless threats. They spoke of the way Thad had stepped in, not with malice, but with a desperate, sudden necessity. The ruling was brief, delivered in a voice that brooked no argument, an accident born of defense, a justified act in a lawless moment. A closed matter. Hargreave had sat in the back of the courtroom, his gloved hands gripping the head of his cane. He did not look pleased. His eyes had burned with the frustrated hunger of a man who had lost his leverage. But the law, for once, did not bend for his coin. The sheriff stood by the door, his hand on his belt, watching Hargreave with a cold, clear warning in his eyes. Hargreave sold his interest in the surrounding parcels by Winter's Edge. He moved on, chasing easier prey in the territories further west, where the shadows were still long enough for men like him to hide. His absence left a strange hollow in the valley, like the sudden, ringing quiet after a persistent, buzzing insect finally disappears. No one missed him. The land, freed from its long tension, seemed to settle into the earth. Autumn arrived gently, a slow bleed of color across the hills. The valley softened into shades of gold, rust, and deep amber. The air grew sharp and sweet, scented with wood smoke and fallen leaves. Annie worked the garden with a calm she hadn't known she was capable of possessing. She moved through her days not with vigilance, but with intention. Her hands still bore the marks of labor, the calluses and the dirt beneath the nails, but they no longer trembled when the wind caught a door or a floorboard creaked. At night, the cabin was warm. It wasn't just the heat from the hearth. It was the density of presence. It was the shared meals where the silence wasn't a minefield, but a comfort. It was the sight of Thad's boots by the door and his heavy coat on the hook. It was the sound of Lila's sleepy voice drifting down the hall, asking for one more story about the man who built the moon. Annie lay awake sometimes, the firelight dancing in orange flickers across the ceiling. She listened to the sounds of the man sleeping beside her, a deep, steady rhythm that anchored her to the shifting world. She no longer startled at the weight of an arm draped across her waist. She no longer braced for the impact of a word or a blow. She rested. Truly rested. The past did not vanish. It never truly does. Samuel remained buried beneath the churchyard soil, his name etched in a stone that was slowly being overtaken by lichen. Annie did not pretend he had never existed. To do so would be to erase the strength she had found in surviving him. But he no longer lived inside the walls of her house. His memory had lost its teeth. One evening, as the first true frost crept along the edges of the grass, turning the blades into silver needles, Annie and Thad stood together at the creek. The water was low again, clear and cold as gin. The stones lay exposed, smoothed by years of patient erosion. The air was so still they could hear the soft snick of a turning leaf hitting the surface of the water. "This place held too much once," Annie said quietly, leaning her head against his shoulder. Thad wrapped a large, warm arm around her, pulling her into the heat of his side. "It still remembers, Annie. Land like this has a long memory." "Yes," she said, turning her face into the scent of him, the wood smoke, the pine, and the deep, masculine musk that now meant safety. "But it doesn't demand anything anymore. It's just water." He looked at her then, really looked at her. In the fading light, his blue eyes were the color of the deep dusk. He didn't look at her as a woman he needed to protect, or a soul he needed to redeem. He looked at her as his equal, a partner standing on the far side of a long, dark wood. "I never thought I'd be allowed to stay anywhere," he whispered, his voice catching. "I thought I was meant to be a ghost until the day I actually became one." Annie reached for his hand, threading her fingers through his calloused, powerful grip. She felt the pulse in his wrist, steady and strong. "Staying isn't something you're allowed, Thad. It's something you earn. Every day, with every board you nail, and every time you look at me." His thumb brushed over her knuckles, a slow, grounding caress that sent a spark of warmth deep into her marrow. "Then I'll keep earning it. For as long as there's breath in me." He turned her fully into his arms then. The kiss was slow, deep, and tasted of the coming winter and the warmth of the hearth. It was a kiss of belonging, of two broken things fitting together to make something whole and unbreakable. His hands were gentle as they traced the line of her jaw, his touch a promise kept. Winter came early that year. A heavy snow blanketed the valley in a hush so complete, it felt like the world was holding its breath, waiting for the spring. The creek froze along its edges, glassy and still, the water moving invisibly beneath the ice. Inside the cabin, the fire burned bright and fierce. Annie stood behind Thad as he sat by the fire, carving a small wooden horse for Lila. His hands were steady, his expression focused, and profoundly peaceful. This was not a fairy tale ending. There were still scars, physical and hidden. There were still nights when the thunder sounded too much like a gunshot, and memories rose unbidden like ghosts. There were days when the old fear whispered that happiness was a borrowed thing, a debt that would eventually be called in. But there was also the truth of the present. Love built slowly, brick by brick, act by act. Safety was forged in the fire of shared trials, not just assumed. There was a man who stood between her and the dark without ever trying to claim her as payment for the service. The creek flowed on, carrying its memories downstream toward the sea. And Annie Carter, once the terrified widow of Dead Man's Creek, stood rooted in her life at last. She was no longer a woman defined by what she had lost, but by what she had chosen to keep. The water remembered everything, but it no longer held her name. It only held the reflection of the woman she had become, a woman who had finally found her home. Outro, and that concludes the final chapter of The Widow of Dead Man's Creek. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey through the valley. This story has been about more than just the shadows of the past. It's been about the courage it takes to build a future when you've forgotten what safety feels like. I hope you found Annie and Thad's story as moving as I did. If you enjoyed this chapter and the journey we've taken together, please take a moment to like this video and leave a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the ending and what you think happens next for Annie, Thad, and little Lila. And of course, if you want to hear more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an update. Your support keeps the stories coming. Until next time, keep the fire burning,